So welcome to my live stream. I hope that you can all hear me all right. My studio is in an urban environment, so there's a lot of traffic and train going by, but hopefully you will be able to hear me okay. In preparation for today's stream, I did make an announcement in a story yesterday and today. And I also invited anybody that wanted to ask some questions. So I have a couple of questions right here. Let me see if I can pronounce this right. Hakana, Una Hakana, maybe that's correct, asks me, what is the most important principles of portrait painting? And wow, that is that is quite a question to start with, I think, because of course there are sort of many components of what a paint consists of. So I think that in terms of a portrait painting, the discussion really begins with the composition as well. So starting with a good composition, and of course this is true for all subject matter in art. Also, if you're painting a still life, I think that really making sure that the composition is strong is crucial. I find that if I don't have a composition that I believe in, I'm not able to continue the project of the painting, really. Because I find that there is no point in a way of refining something and resolving something if the composition doesn't work. So for portrait painting, I think that the discussion can kind of begin with the design of the shadow and the light, for instance. And so with this portrait that you see me working on right now, you can see like a really clear light shape and you see a really clear shadow shape. And it's not a rule that the proportion of light to shadow has to be in this way. But it is a really good principle guideline to at least start off with a light situation where you have one strong shadow shape design and a strong light shape design. And by no means does it mean that it has to just be all in shadow or all in light. Even just the tiniest bit of shadow can kind of be enough to give a nice sense of structure. And I find that for this composition, I was really intrigued by how the nose became sort of the division between the shadow and the light. And there's this really lovely sort of architecture of shapes right here. Also how that shadow moves into her eyebrow and kind of frames her eye that is in the shadow. So thinking about the design of the shadow and the light is a really helpful start in evaluating the composition of a portrait, and I think setting up a situation that can provide some really interesting kind of arrangements of shapes and also help to kind of convey the underlying structure of the portrait in a good way. And having a good shadow shape really helps for that venture. Other elements of what's the basic principle or what's the most important principles of portrait painting? Well, it really does help to get a sense of the symmetry. So, you know, proportions is one thing, but also the sense of symmetry. So to really think about how the alignment of, for example, the eyes, how that relates to the alignment of the nose and to the mouth and the chin, like finding that sense of symmetry is, I think, really essential. I would maybe even say more so than absolute 100% likeness. In a way, I mean, if you're working with a commissioned portrait, being able to work with a sense of likeness is important. Of course, if you're going to make it look like somebody specific. But if you are not, and it's more just about conveying a theme or a feeling or, you know, so on and so forth, if the proportion of the nose ends up being a little bit too long, for example, that matters, in my opinion, less in the context of portraiture than if one eye is too high up in relationship to the other, because that is ultimately going to affect how you will read the final painting. If you compare a painting to a person, you can maybe determine if there is a strong likeness or not. But the element of symmetry is going to carry into just how you observe the painting, independent of whether the model is there or not, in a way. So just in other words, the painting has to be able to carry itself. It has to be able to read on its own. So that's some thoughts. You could probably go even further into the sort of most important principles of portrait painting, but just as a move along here, I think that's a discussion that can carry into the dawn, in a way. So let's just kind of begin answering that question with first kind of thinking about a setup that is nice and strong and good and conducive to see structure and create an interesting design. And then I think really looking at the sense of symmetry on the portrait will be a close follow-up into what could be the most important principles of portrait painting. Let's see, Ruth Squeeters. I'm sorry, I probably did not pronounce that surname at all. But she asked me a question about background color and treatment. And I wanted to sort of reflect on that as I'm working with this particular painting, because the background color and the treatment is actually something I've just been pondering on or really wondering about as I have been working on it today. So I didn't do all of this today. This is a continuation. This is probably my third painting session of this portrait. And so I painted the portrait and the hair on another day. And so I haven't really touched that area today. So I'm just letting the background and I don't think it is a kimono. I've been calling it a kimono, but sort of the robe that she's wearing. I've been working on these elements today. So in terms of when I set up this painting, an aspect that really fascinated me about the composition was exactly that element of color and using color to compose with. And so this relationship that I have here, there is a red background and then there is overall greenish, bluish silk, is a very complementary relationship because of course green is a complementary color to red. There's also a very strong orange undertone in this background, which is complementary to blue. And there's also a lot of blue undertones here. So there is a really interesting, I think, and very vibrant relationship between the color of the background to the robe. In a way, they are each other's opposite, but that is also where there can be a really interesting kind of relationship that is formed between these two colors. As I've been working on the background, today I have been thinking about creating really dynamic shifts. So I have one area over here and over here, which is a combination of mostly black and alizarin crimson, so it's really quite dark. And then as the transition moves into the dark, into these lighter areas, it starts to become a little bit lighter and lighter, and it starts to become a little bit more red, and then it goes a little bit more orangey. So there is a really subtle but a rather dramatic shift of color going on. And I want to, in a way, create a balance between, when it comes to the background, creating a background that is really dynamic, but also is kind of the subconscious element of the painting in a way. So that as you're looking at the painting, you know, your eyes and your mind and your heart will be drawn to the subject matter, in this case, a portrait. So maybe you don't necessarily think about the background other than the color element of it. But that's even so, the treatment of the texture is a really important part of the background, and to create a point of interest even in something that is kind of in the background, that is in the subconscious part of the painting. So I do really investigate the brush strokes with a lot of deliberation, making sure that it is dynamic and varied, so that as your eyes are resting in one location of the background, for example, that there is information and variation there that will also sort of stimulate your eyes and maybe your mind as well. So I want it to be partly an area where you can rest, but also an area that is engaging. And I'm thinking about that, those two aspects in relationship to the portrait. In this situation, I am using a lot of kind of overlapping brushstroke technique in order to obtain this sort of this sense of really subtle variation. And then I have gone into some areas. I'm not really sure if I'm going to keep this yet. I think I might. I think I like it actually, where I really created sort of a abstract design with the brushstroke. And I wanted it to look random, but is quite deliberate. So, for instance, I had a little bit too much texture here at one point, so I decided to kind of paint into that and, reveal something that looks coincidental, but it's partly something that is very deliberate. Yeah, but the background, I think, it's just a really fascinating subject matter overall. Because it's something that is in the background. It is something that is kind of a subconscious element of the painting, but if it doesn't work well, it really does affect how the whole painting kind of reads. So I see a lot of kind of comments and hearts and flowers coming up on my on my feed right here. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much again for tuning in to this live stream. And this is my first live stream, so yeah, this is an exciting thing to do, I think. I'll probably continue doing it in the future as well, and hopefully be better at it in time as well. I find it always a little bit tricky to speak while painting. I tend to compartmentalize a lot, but this is a great exercise. I had another question here from Now, who asked me the quality of, I think it was oil that was the question. I think it was just misspelled a little bit in the question session as oleum. But quality of oil, so I'm just going to go with that as a question and see if I can find some answers to it. There are, of course, a lot of different mediums available to painters today, and we have to kind of filter through a lot of products that are made available to us. Maybe some products that are really useful. And I do also think that there may be some products on the market that I don't know how useful it is. Like I don't know how important it is to have, damar, for example, in your medium, because there are some things like that may do certain things or create certain effects. But at the end of the day, if you just stick with oil and paint, you're not risking kind of messing up the kind of chemistry of the painting, because paint is a combination of pigment and oil. And so typically paint will be ground in linseed oil, and then there are also some paint brands that will grind their paint in walnut oil. Maybe some colors will be ground in walnut oil, and then there are some other options out there as well. But I recommend purchasing paint that is made with either walnut oil or linseed oil, and that is also the two main, actually the two only mediums that I use as I'm painting. I'm really conservative when it comes to the kind of chemistry part of painting, because I just don't want to mess with it. I'm not a scientist, I'm not a chemist. I want to make sure that the choices that I make as a painter will be kind of the best choices available for the longevity of my painting. And so while there could be some interesting effects created by mediums, I find that I don't really need that kind of in my painting process, because I find that what paint inherently does on itself is just so fascinating and beautiful and just filled with so many possibilities. So I like to kind of paint, with paint rather than with a concoction of sort of strange mediums and whatnot. Now, both linseed oil and walnut oil have been around for hundreds of years. So we do know, what some of those long-term effects of using these oils are. Like if you go to a museum, you can kind of see how have the paint or the paintings from that time sort of lasted. Of course, it must be mentioned that, when you go to and see like paintings from the Baroque or Renaissance, those paintings are really cared for as well. So certainly it's not just about the quality of the materials. It also has to do with how these paintings are treated and kept and taken care of. Okay, that aside, it's still sort of a really important indication to actually use materials, or that we can use materials today that have been around for so long, so we do know a little bit like what the long-term effects are. And so that is part of the reason of why I just decided to paint with a combination or either walnut oil or linseed oil. So both are really historically used oils. Linseed oil may be a little bit more accessible today. I know, being Norwegian, I am familiar with the European art market, and somehow I just find it really difficult to find walnut oil, especially in Scandinavia. Somehow that was very difficult to obtain, whereas linseed oil was in ample supply. Now I'm living in New York, or New York area, and I think the kind of shops that are here, they overlap in terms of some of the paint materials with what is available in the European market. But anyway, I can just really speak of what you can obtain here versus in Europe. I don't know what's available in India or in Africa or in South America. Anyway, little segue there. I do like to use walnut oil in my painting process because if you compare it to linseed oil, it's a oil that may dry a little bit less flexible than linseed oil, but it is also an oil that is prone to yellow less a little bit than, or yellow less than linseed oil. And so that's kind of where I weigh the balance of if I choose to use walnut oil or linseed oil. So for example, if I'm working on a painting that is on a stretch canvas, maybe I will choose linseed oil because I know that the paint film will remain a little bit more flexible over time than walnut oil. But if I'm painting on a solid support, or I have a canvas that is adhered to solid support, such as is the case with this actually, then I like to use walnut oil. Because the sort of potential negative elements of it drying a little bit less flexible is mitigated by the fact that it is on a solid support that is not going to move or fluctuate to the same extent as like a stretched canvas. So as I'm working on the area of the silk right now, I'm really kind of just being rather sloppy, but that's okay because I'm not really working on refining the material yet. I'm kind of just mapping out where I have a variation of dark and light, and I had sort of previously indicated a really dark value here, and I had previously also indicated a really light value there, and now I am just blocking in the rest of the sleeve in relationship to that sort of color value range. So I'm working with rather sort of large and fairly kind of rough planes, and then eventually I will go into each area and refine the information there further along. I'm using a variation of brushes right now. So I have this that is kind of larger. I have these guys that are a little bit smaller. This is a hog hair brush. These are sable hair brushes. This is a synthetic, I believe. I don't discriminate. I like to use whatever brush gets the job done, and it's great to use a few different types of brushes because I find that they have different, slightly different personalities, and they can collaborate well together. So using this bigger brush is great to apply paint with and kind of think in terms of larger planes. And then maybe I will go in and use these smaller brushes to kind of bring out more structure of a line or a shape. And then I'm working with these two also for transitions. So I have this softer brush, sable hair, for softer transitions where I want to have more of an atmospheric shift. And then I have, while this is a synthetic brush, it's quite firm, like it has a nice snap. So it enables me to also add a little bit more texture where suitable. So I'm using this kind of parallel to my hog hair bristle brush where I want to add a little bit more kind of texture. So to obtain this color richness that I have in this particular painting, I have quite a few chromatic colors on my palette. So to get this green, I tried actually mixing a green using ultramarine blue and a cadmium lemon yellow because I thought that that could give me this cool green, but it just did not kind of reach that chromatic intensity that is very much an essence of this fabric. So I brought out my phthalo green. And phthalo green out of the tube is quite dark, sort of similar to alizarin crimson in that regard. And then it has an incredible tinting strength, which means that as it is mixed with white, it still retains a really strong kind of chromatic intensity, even as the value is becoming rather light. So I wasn't able to obtain like this kind of color intensity, just mixing ultramarine blue, yellow, and white. So this helped me to get there. And then for the background, I have a combination of black and alizarin crimson. I have a fair bit of cadmium red, and then I also have a cadmium orange. And yeah, I think that's about it. But that's a quite complex spectrum. It's a little bit more color than I usually have on my palette. So I didn't need any of that for the portrait, but I do need it for the background and her robe. So this color is actually just almost just phthalo green tinted with white. So it actually became quite straightforward to mix this color value range. I think eventually I want to build up some interesting textures right here on the collar. But for now, I'm sort of mostly searching for the color value and also the structure in this zone. And then I will start to investigate more the kind of sculptural aspects of the oil paint once I have resolved a little bit more of these kind of color value and shape relationships. So in terms of the robe, I have been allowing this area here to lead the way. Well, after I had brought in the darkest dark, which is here, and then some of the lighter masses through here, I developed this first. This is by no means resolved yet. I'm going to go in here and continue sort of chiseling out more interesting shape designs and resolving transitions and whatnot. But I kind of like to circle into this area and then maybe let my attention also trickle down into the sleeve, because of course these areas right here speaks of the underlying structure of her shoulder on the other side, and then how the neck is sort of attached to the format of the shoulder. So, you know, these relationships I find sort of structurally more important than some of the shapes that happen through here. Like even if some of this may remain a little bit unresolved, I think the image can work. Whereas if the proportion here was a little bit off, you know, it would affect that sense of proportion and accuracy. So that is one of the reasons I'm kind of letting this kind of lead the way, and then I cycle through or circle through the different areas of the painting. Okay, so I'm just looking at the side screen right here, and Christian Castro asked if this is alla prima. And let's see if there's anything else. Well, kind of. In a way, alla prima just means like one go, one layer, or the first layer. So it sort of specifically refers to just painting and resolving a painting in one go. So on that note, no, it is not alla prima, because I have built this up in like with an underpainting, where I just used kind of just a monochromatic technique. Actually, I used a purple ochre mixed with a burnt sienna, and that was my sort of underpainting mix. That was a really beautiful combination, actually. It dried a little bit slower than raw umber and burnt umber. So I did sort of feel that the next day when I continued the underpainting, but it dried still fast enough for me to be able to continue just the day after. Anyway, so I did do an underpainting using a monochromatic technique. So I think then per definition, what I'm doing here, or this portrait painting, is not completely alla prima. However, how I am approaching this is how you would with an alla prima. Like the way that I'm approaching this today, I'm thinking about the different aspects of the final results. I'm regarding the color and the value and the shape and the transitions. So I'm kind of working with all of these phenomenon together. So as you would when working with an alla prima. So yeah, it's kind of a hybrid. In a way, I'm using the same mindset on this particular layer as you would in an alla prima process, but it's just built from a foundation based on the monochromatic process. And then I don't think I'm going to finish this today. I think that I will see how far I can push this along, and then I'm going to continue developing her hair and her portrait. And I think I'm going to do some of that on another day. So yeah, per definition, it's not pure alla prima, but I'm using now kind of a alla prima technique and mindset. So I guess you can say it's sort of like a layered alla prima. Because I'm not using a glazing technique, and like that would be probably the opposite side of the spectrum to what is referred to as an alla prima. A glazing technique, you would maybe have a really intricate drawing beforehand and then, layer the color on top of that. So, or there's other forms of more indirect painting processes as well. But the way I'm approaching this is very much a combination, I think, of like a direct painting technique, such as you would employ in alla prima, but based on something that is kind of indirect when I worked with the monochromatic on the painting. So I do have a fairly extensive color palette for this painting. I have lead white, I have a cadmium lemon yellow, I have ochre here, although I'm not really using it right now. I also have a cadmium yellow deep, I have a cadmium orange, I have a cadmium red, so a lot of really colorful warms, and I need kind of all of them in order to express the colorfulness of the background. And then I did bring in, I have a Lister crimson, and then I have a ultramarine blue, and then I have a phthalo green, and I have a ivory black. I also have a purple ochre, but I'm not using that right now. I'll be using that when I'm painting the shadow shape of her portrait. Let's see. So I have actually 3 value scales. I have set up a sort of color value scale that is just sort of dedicated for the blouse or for the gown, or what she's wearing. So let's see. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 mixtures there. That's actually quite a lot. And then for the background, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 mixtures. I did mix up some colors for the skin as well, but I'm not sure if I'll be using them today. Let's see, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I have about 9 mixtures for the skin. So if I had a much more of a simplified background and a sort of situation right here, maybe I would just put everything in one kind of color value line. But just to help organizing my sort of observation of the color and the values, I'm laying out my colors this way. You know what? I won't be able to move my camera right now, but after this live stream, I will take a picture of the palette and post it so you can have a look. And you'll also see that I'm letting my brush strokes kind of move around in some of these areas. And that is because even if I mix up a color value string, I will maybe find that I need to tweak a color here or a value there. So then I will use my out of the tube colors or maybe some other mixtures to kind of tweak a color mixture that I have. So you will see a little bit of kind of brush stroke activity, especially around the value string for the shirt or for the blouse or the gown or kimono or whatever it is, and a value string for the background as well. So I like to think about it like this, that the palette or arranging the palette is kind of like fine-tuning an instrument, to a subject matter, and then I do allow my brush to move around and dance around and kind of fluctuate so that there is a kind of organic element to the painting process as well. I'm not too attached with having one brush per mixture. I don't typically do that. But I do end up with a whole bunch of brushes at the end of the painting day. But that's the combination. But of course, I wouldn't use a background brush into the silk, and I wouldn't use this color value in the background because that would just turn to mud. So I do kind of keep my brushes sort of separated in that way. But as you're seeing, I'm using this brush and I'm kind of letting it travel through many different areas of the sleeve. Like it's moving in areas that are a little bit lighter, and it is moving in areas that are becoming a little darker as well. But I wouldn't want to have any light or any white in the area of the shadow, because then it will become too light, so it would affect the value there. So for that area, I will take another brush or make sure that I I keep kind of just a brush designated for that zone. And the same is true here too. In order to have the color, just clarity and intensity in the lightest areas, I want to make sure I'm not affecting that mixture with something that will dull it down a little. So this is just a combination of white and phthalo green. So I want to make sure that I'm not using a brush that contains any red or any brown or any black or anything that would affect the value or the color integrity of that zone. But in areas where it's a little bit of both, I'm a little bit more kind of free with how I am allowing my brush to move around. So the oil that I'm using is actually just straight walnut oil. Was it by Graham? Sorry, I need glasses. I'm looking at my bottle, but it's across the room and I'm not able to go and grab it right now. Okay, I'll take a picture of that as well, and so you can have a look at my my sort of Instagram page after. So I will include that as well. And that's the only oil I'm using, only medium I'm using. Otherwise, I'm really just using mostly paint. Maybe initially I put a little bit of just oil just to reactivate the preceding layer that I had worked on previously to this painting session, just to revisit and see the color and the value clearly. But in these areas, I haven't actually used any medium. I just used paint, just pure oil paint. Sometimes when just covering in an overall area, if the paint is quite thick, it can, of course, just be a little bit more of an effort to let the brush move. Maybe then I will dip my brush into a little bit of oil to kind of make it that initial scumble, but then I will usually paint into that as well. So that kind of relationship between oil and pigment tends to kind of even out and restabilize. So what I mean to say is that I don't want to overly dilute my paint with medium. I want to, as much as possible, paint with the texture of paint and not sort of other elements. George Johannan from Natural Pigments, I think, came up with a really good sort of visual metaphor to what paint is. If you imagine that the pigments are kind of like bricks in a wall, and the oil is kind of like the mortar. You need both in order to create a strong wall, because with too many bricks, there isn't anything to kind of glue them together, but with too much mortar, there isn't anything to stabilize it. So that is in essence what oil paint is. So when oil paint is overly diluted, that will kind of be the equivalent of just having a wall, or having a brick wall with a lot of mortar but not enough bricks. It's a really good metaphor for that kind of the structure that oil paint is. Also, I'll just mention that the palette and also the other stages for this particular painting, for those of you who may be interested in looking into that, will be posted on my Patreon page in March. Yeah, in March. So I'll go into showing more specifically the pigments and also the different brands that I have on this particular palette, and also the various stages of this painting. And you can find the link right by my bio on my Instagram page. Alexander Debinam asked about flake white. I am using lead white. And flake white historically is a form of lead white. There actually is several different types of lead whites, and there's different processes to make lead white as well. So that has kind of created the foundation to why there are different names to lead white. Then of course you have Kremser white, which is a place in Holland that produced lead white kind of back in the day. And so that can be a little bit confusing. So there are just many different forms of, well, there's different sources and different ways or processes that lead white is made, and that is why it has sort of different names. Something to be wary of is that paint manufacturers today, not all of them, but some will name, for example, a white pigment flake white, for example, and it will be kind of a mix of titanium or zinc white or something other than flake white. But just to know that historically flake white is a lead white. And so always look at the back of the tube when you evaluate what pigments the paint actually consists of. There should be a pigment number or a pigment name. So I do like to use a lead white when I'm painting because I really like the feel of it, and I like the body of it. There's a nice sort of full body to lead white. You can build texture with it with ease. And I also really like how fast it dries. So I can be fairly confident that if I paint a sort of semi-thick layer of lead white, like for example when I painted on this portrait, the next day it was already dry. So I could continue working with it. So I really enjoy that because it helps to kind of expedite the drying process of the paintings as well. But lead white, of course, is a tricky one because it does have toxicity concerns. You have to really work with it with care, make sure that you don't sand your painting or anything like that. I wouldn't recommend doing that anyway, because any form of dust is not good for our lungs, even flour, you know. So, but especially when it comes to like a pigment like lead white, you want to make sure that you're using a process of painting that is healthy. And if you look at my hands, there is not a single sort of brush stroke or paint or color on my hands, because I do really take care to keep a really sort of clean painting practice, precisely because I'm working with not just lead white, but also other colors I don't want to ingest in any way. Now, lead white is also historically used, so when you go to a museum and you look at the masterpieces from the Renaissance or the Baroque or the Rococo, and even further back than that, the paintings or the artwork were made with lead white. And what makes lead white so absolutely unreplaceable in the context of the professional artist is that it's not only a pigment that is a pleasure to work with, but it is also one of the pigments that has the reputation of really standing the test of time compared to other colors. So lead white is one of the leanest colors that we can have on our palette. It is also one of the most flexible pigments that are out there. So as paint ages, it becomes a bit more brittle, but the properties of lead white remain fairly flexible, sort of relative to other colors. So it has sort of this personality that is sort of really strong and durable, and it can withstand the test of time much more than other colors. But if you're just starting out painting, or you can't access paint white because you live in Europe or something like that, then my recommendation would be to use titanium white, and just avoid zinc white. Zinc white is sort of a point of tension right now because there's sort of fairly recent discoveries of how the long-term kind of behavior of zinc white is. So it is known now for not just becoming more brittle over time, but also it could have the tendency of to delaminate. And that, I think, is the greatest concern. The idea that paint can kind of break away from the ground and just kind of crumble away. That is probably just the outmost sort of nightmarish scenario I can think of as a painter. Like, I would say that that is far more detrimental, of course, than kind of cracks being formed. So we don't want the delamination. So there are some paint manufacturers that will say that this concern is exaggerated, and maybe that is true. We don't know yet, so I just therefore choose not to take that risk. And I also advise sort of other painters where you're just starting to paint, or you're in a professional capacity, but you don't want to, or you can't paint with lead white for whatever reason. Just recommend just use titanium white, and make sure that you read what the contents are on the back of the tube, so that you don't risk buying something that is called titanium white or that is called flake white and then it contains zinc. Titanium white also will be fairly brittle compared to, well, anything actually will be really brittle compared to lead white. So that is also true for titanium. So just to kind of mitigate that, you could consider working on a panel or a canvas that is adhered to a panel when working with something like a titanium white, just to kind of equalize the potential side effect of it also becoming a bit brittle and kind of cracking. Alexander, do you grind your own lead white? We have to in England these days, can't buy it mixed. Yeah, that is a concern actually. I never have ground my lead white. Because as we sort of just talked about, lead white is of course a concern to use if you were to convert it into powder or to dust. You don't want to inhale lead white dust. Whereas when lead white is locked into kind of the film of paint, it's not really a concern unless you were to digest it by like eating it in some way. There is not a concern about fumes. It doesn't have any fumes, so it's not dangerous like that. So you can work with it, and just as long as you kind of keep clean and also avoid secondary contamination. Like, for example, some painters like to use like a smock or an apron. I do too, actually, when painting, but I do not wipe my brushes clean on what I'm wearing. So that is actually something to consider, that if you do that, then eventually your paint can kind of break away from that fabric and convert into dust. And so I would avoid doing that when working with paint overall, but especially something like lead white. So just a little side note about that. Yeah, so it is a frustration, I think, for professional painters who use lead white, that in the European market it is becoming extremely, or it already has become so restrictive that you can't go to the art supply shop anymore and buy these sort of necessary tools for our craft. I don't think that it's important or necessary for somebody who's just beginning to paint to work with lead white. I think just use titanium white and kind of figure out what kind of painter you are, if you're really messy, or if in fact lead white would be something that is suitable to your practice. But sort of back to this aspect of lead white restriction to Europe, or in Europe, it definitely is a problem. And so So to find or to create or to have access to lead white, painters today kind of have to make their own lead white. Yeah, but kind of back to that, I never have, because I never wanted to deal with the kind of powder and the potential sort of toxicity concern with lead white when dealing with it in powder form. So if you do that, of course, you have to take, especially clear, have a really good mask and ventilation process, and do not, grind your lead white in a studio with a draft, or don't do it outside. Just do it in a place where you can kind of control your environment. Let's see. Yeah, so Alexander, I do sympathize, I do empathize actually with that situation, to have to grind your own lead white. So my husband Stephen Bauman and I, we just moved to the States in 2016, and so we also experienced that shift happening in Europe. When we were art students in Florence, we could buy lead white in the art store, and then kind of by the time we left Florence, it started to become really difficult to get lead white, and it also started to become really expensive. And now it's pretty much just a closed gate, which is really frustrating from the professional artist perspective. Let's see, maybe I have time for one more question today. Let's see. Hilario Esteban Lopez asks, what specific size brush do you use for details? Okay, so let's see. I'm just going to grab my whole bundle of brushes. These are the brushes I have been working with today. And I do find it very tedious to wash brushes, but I forget all about that as I'm painting. I tend to just grab a brush when I find that now I need a new brush or a fresh brush for a particular passage or whatnot. So I have been using these sort of larger brushes for the background. They're not very large if you just compare it to my hand. They're quite small. But I've been using them as I've been working with the layering of the color values there. And then for the blouse or the gown, I still don't know what to say about it. The turquoise silk fabric. I blocked it in using these larger brushes, and I probably will bring out these larger brushes now and then just to restate a larger plane. And then as I have sort of these larger forms starting to appear, I start to go down in brush size, where I then can kind of go into an area and fish out a little bit more detail. So lately I've been really enjoying working with, let's see now. Here are my smaller brushes, Escoda Grafilo brushes. I really do love them a lot for working with fine detail. So they're great for the drawing, but also for really intricate modeling. Or modeling or working with really subtle transitions in sort of smaller areas. I do use synthetic brushes as well, but I find that a real natural sort of sable hairbrush have a much more sort of specific control with it. Sometimes using a synthetic brush, it can kind of take away paint while it adds paints, whereas I find that that doesn't happen with sort of real natural hair brushes. So I recommend these guys. These are my favorite. I have a few of them, and I always end up in my hand. Like I always will, conclude a painting session with a bunch of my, or with all of the Grafilo brushes that I have. All right, so I'm going to let you guys go about your day, and I will do the same. And I'll make sure to take a picture of my palette and also the oil that I used for this painting session. And for those of you who are interested in seeing the earlier and also the latter stages of this portrait, I will be posting it in my March portrait painting video demonstration on my Patreon page. So for those of you who are interested, please just go to the bio or my bio on my Instagram page, and you can see the link to my Patreon page right there. So I just want to thank you all for joining me today in this little snippet of painting process. Thank you so much for your questions and your smiles and your thumbs up and your positivity and joy. I really appreciate it, and you guys definitely made me want to do this again. So I'll do that in the not too distant future. We'll do some more live streaming. Thank you so much, and have an awesome day. Bye.